back from HMRC, there's a disclaimer, you know, it's not a legally binding advice. Where you do want that next level of clarity, that real belts and braces approach, then you can apply for what we call a binding tariff information, which is where you give HMRC all of the information that I've just mentioned, but then they'll probably ask for samples as well, although they're not accepting them at the moment with COVID. But they will turn that around, give you a decision on what they think the commodity code, or what they're telling you the commodity code will be. And that is legally binding, and it's valid for 3 years with the option to extend. So where it's really difficult to ascertain your particular product within a tariff, then that's a belts and braces approach to make sure that you're compliant. Exporters and importers, I think that it's important for both parties to be very sure of making sure they're using the right commodity code, because exporters, albeit they're not instantly impacted, they're passing the problem down the line. So they could be exporting goods, their customers could be paying import duty and VAT on those goods, but at the wrong level because they've not classified their goods correctly. But importers especially, it's incumbent on you to ensure that you're importing the goods under the correct commodity code. And you do, as an importer, have the ability to change a commodity code. So if what is arriving in the UK and is on the commercial invoice you believe actually isn't correct for your goods, obviously you want to notify your supplier, but you can change that commodity code so that what you're declaring to HMRC is correct. Obviously you reference that throughout your commercial paperwork, but it is most important that you make sure that the import declaration is correct and it's declaring the right goods. Okay, so BTIs is kind of like that belts and braces approach. I wanted to touch a little bit about preference. So going back a few slides, when I talked about our preferential landscape as part of the EU and how some of that is disappearing, we've got the notion of the generalized system of preference. And this is unaffected by Brexit. It's a WTO initiative. So GSP, or the Generalized System of Preference, it's where we in the Western world agree to import goods from certain countries at a reduced or zero rate of duty in order to boost their industrial strategy, boost their economy, so boost their exports. And as I say, it's a WTO initiative. The UK has signed up to it independently. So if you're importing goods from any of the countries that I mentioned here, then that won't be affected by Brexit. You'll continue to import those goods. Obviously, you need that proof of origin, which if you're importing from these countries, you'll know that the Form A has pretty much been phased out, and now exporters in these countries use the REC system, which is kind of like a self-declaration of origin. But you do need that in order to clear the goods when they come into the UK. But effectively, if you're importing from these countries, you'll see very little difference, to be honest. Okay, so that's import preference. Now, we touched a little bit about documentation changes and the increase in terms of documentation that we have to provide with a consignment. So there are a number of documents that need to accompany your goods, and it will be the commodity code that determines what your goods require. So whether they require a license, whether they require any specific certification, whether they require any pre-notification or pre-authorization before they can be cleared to import. But as a bare minimum, we'd see these kind of documents. So you'll have your declaration, which here I've just put an image of the C88. Depending on your plans for the 1st of January and beyond, you may have signed up a freight forwarder or an agent to do all this for you, which is highly recommended, given, you know, we've got to allow this to bed in a little bit. These guys are the experts. They've been doing it for however long. If you've signed up one of those, they'll be making the import declaration on your behalf, or you might have chosen to obtain your chief badge and purchase third-party software that will allow you to make the declarations yourself. So the C88, as we call it, the single administrative document in its paper form, looks quite scary because it's used for imports and exports, and it's kind of like, well, which boxes for which? If you're using a software suite, then obviously it guides you through the declaration. So you'd make, initially it's an import declaration, and then it will only require you to fill in the fields that pertain to an import declaration. But that's your core document. That is your import declaration, and everything else kind of hangs off that. So within your import dossier, you'll have your import declaration and all the supplementary data. The commercial invoice from your supplier is what helps you fill in much of the fields within the C88. But then you'll also have your packing list for your goods coming in. If you're importing under preference, then you will have a preference certificate or preference documentation. It could be that your commodity code for the goods demands that you have a certificate of origin, so that is issued for non-preferential trade. So there's no trade agreement in place, but the UK government might want to just determine that it's importing goods from certain countries and not from others. You'll have your bill of lading, airway bill, CMR, so that's kind of like your transport documentation. But then depending on your commodity code, it will dictate whether there's any other certificates that are needed. So any certificates of conformity, phytosanitary certificates, export health certificates, we're going to see a lot on the movement of live animals and products of animal origin are going to need export health certificates. And then license for controlled goods. So controlled goods can be military goods, so they'll always need a license, to dual use goods that can be used for both military and civil applications. And then also some works of fine art require licenses as well. So you will see against your commodity code what your documentary requirements are. And then also you'll have your insurance if your supplier is arranging this. So depending on the Incoterm that they're trading with, they will have arranged insurance, and you need to have that that evidence as well in order to clear your goods. Okay, so there's a lot more involved than what we presently have to do to ship goods into the UK from the EU. But if you're bringing in goods from the rest of the world, you'll be familiar with some of these requirements already. In terms of determining what documentation you require, the government has this tool, which I think is fair to say it's still a work in progress. But you can share it with your suppliers in the EU if you wanted to, because it clearly sets out for them the documentation that they're going to have to provide with the goods in order for you to be able to clear them in the EU. So both parties are involved in terms of making sure that that kind of shipment goes smoothly and goods aren't held up. So your suppliers will be able to put the country that they're exporting from, so say France, if you're bringing goods from France, they'd select their commodity code, and then based on this system will give them the tariffs and charges on entering the UK, which is really for them, if they were doing something like delivered duty paid and they were picking up the duty and the import VAT, then it's important that they know that. But more importantly, it gives them a list of the documentation that they're going to need to provide to have the goods cleared in the UK, and then any specific requirements relating to that particular commodity code that they're going to need to meet. So it's an okay system. I think, like I say, it's a work in progress. It's still defaulting us to a whole ton of EU regulation, which isn't very user friendly, and I think that will change over time. Certainly the check duties and tariffs that the government's done for the system going the other way, so allowing us to determine what EU companies will pay on our goods, is a lot more advanced, and I'm hoping that this one goes the same way. Customs special procedures. So as I said earlier, there are a number. We're part of the Union Customs Code, if you like, which and we will continue to be part of that, if you like, when we leave. And that allows us to have a certain amount of facilitations or simplifications when we're importing goods. And as I say, it allows for us to suspend duty and import VAT on certain goods, depending on where the goods are going. So if we're importing goods for repair, so they're going to be repaired in the UK and then re-exported, we can obtain something called inward processing, which allows us to suspend the duty and the VAT on those goods when they come into the UK. They stay within that customs procedure, so and then they're repaired and they're sent back out. That's inward processing. But similarly, we can, there's the notion of both processing and repairs under inward processing. So we could technically be bringing in components from the EU that make up part of our finished goods, and we process them or we manufacture them here in the UK. If they are then subsequently re-exported outside of the UK, then that duty and that VAT never becomes payable. And indeed, when they're released into free circulation within the UK, then that VAT and import duty only becomes due once those goods leave that customs procedure and go into free circulation. And even then, it's the import duties on the finished goods rather than on the independent components. So that's a good one to look at. Other ones, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with the government's recent drive for free ports. So we've got the notion of customs warehouses, where within the UK there are certain warehouses where we can import our goods from the rest of the world. The duty and the VAT is suspended on those goods until they're released into free circulation. And similarly, if you're just bringing them into the UK and then re-exporting them somewhere else, then that duty and VAT is permanently suspended, if you like. It doesn't become payable. In addition to customs warehouses, the government has also set out its objectives for establishing 10 free ports around the UK, which will be locations, quite vast locations, probably inland, where duty and VAT is suspended. So you will have manufacturers set up there, you will have certain offices set up there, and there's a whole load of fiscal benefits from being located in those ports. But it's a way of boosting our kind of manufacturing and our production, because while those goods are within those free ports, that duty and that VAT is suspended. So again, they've opened it up to competitive bidding now. There are some of the big ports around the country that we know have expressed an interest, and it's a fantastic initiative. Currently, we've only got one, which is in the Isle of Man, and we know they work so well because we see them all over the world. And it's a fantastic way of driving inward investment to some underprivileged areas or deprived areas. So, you know, perhaps some of the ports in the northeast, for example, where they have huge swathes of land that they could set up these free ports, that would be a fantastic initiative for those areas. So simplified procedures. Outward processing is another one. If you are sending goods outside of the UK to be repaired, so the flip side, the opposite of inward processing, then you can suspend the duties also. So there's a number of them. I provided the link for more information, but they're really a way of suspending that tax or suspending that duty and then that import VAT. So could be something that you could look at and would benefit you from a cash flow perspective. Customs procedure codes, this kind of links with what I've just been talking about. So those customs procedures I'm talking about, there's a code on the C88 or on the import declaration that clearly states to HMRC and also the local customs offices why these goods are moving. So are they moving outside of the UK on a permanent export? Are they moving into the UK on a permanent import? Or are they coming into the UK for customs warehousing or inward processing? And there's the notion of goods moving from one customs procedure to another. So a good can come in from the UK under inward processing and then immediately be put into a customs warehouse. So it's this code that determines that for the import declaration and tells Chief, the underlying system, and HMRC that that duty is suspended. Valuation. So those of you importing from the rest of the world will be familiar with the fact that the amount on the commercial invoice isn't always what we pay our duty and VAT on. So if your commercial invoice from your supplier doesn't reflect the freight and the insurance, then that needs to go into the valuation build-up, because HMRC will charge duty on the cost of goods, the freight and the insurance, and then they charge import VAT on the whole amount after that. Okay, so there's the notion of valuation build-up for import. Again, if your customs agents are doing this for you, fantastic. They'll be very familiar with the kind of fields that are filled in, because there are certain allowable discounts that can go in. It's quite a complicated calculation that goes into determining that dutiable value, if you like. How it works, I've just kind of mentioned in terms of the valuation of goods for HMRC. You've got the invoice price of the goods, so that would typically be the ex-works price. Then you've got the cost of your freight, the cost of your insurance, cost of your freight. That gives you your customs value. Then your duty is applied to that customs value, and that gives you your VAT value. So then VAT is applied to all of this. So it's VAT on top of the 12,240, which gives you your actual price to clear the goods in the UK is almost 50% higher than the cost of the goods, if you like, unless the VAT is recoverable. So it's important that you recognise that the face value of the invoice, or the cost of the goods on the commercial invoice, isn't necessarily on what the duty and the VAT will be calculated on. Again, just talking about import duty and VAT, I suppose one thing to mention is obviously in the should we be able to sign a trade deal, then that import duty goes away, hopefully on all goods coming in from the EU, but we will see. There may still be some level of duty on cap goods, for example. And then there's the notion of import VAT. Now, the new border operating model allows you to use postponed VAT accounting for that VAT, so that VAT doesn't become payable in order to clear the goods at customs necessarily. And also, as I mentioned earlier, with the phasing in of the import declarations, you could potentially have up to 6 months for that duty to become payable. Now, the important thing to mention there is that in order to take advantage of that facilitation, you're going to have a duty deferment account backed up by a customs comprehensive guarantee. I'm just reminding myself which slide comes next. Yeah, we'll talk about that deferment account now. So a deferment account, how it operates typically is it allows you to defer that duty and VAT until the following month. So say if your consignment came in on the 16th of October, you'd have until the 15th of November to pay that import duty and VAT to HMRC. Now, HMRC love duty deferment accounts because it allows the flow of goods to keep going. They're not waiting for individual traders to settle up with them before they can release goods. So they love duty deferment accounts. As I say, they are actively promoting it as a facilitation post-transition, and they've made it slightly easier in so much as historically, to have a duty deferment account, you've had to have a customs comprehensive guarantee, which is obtained by your bank. And obviously, as we know, with the current climate, banks can be a little bit risk averse. So HMRC has just said that, or just released rules, and actually you can apply for it now. They've released the link to apply, that they've introduced a 10k waiver on that customs guarantee. So providing you're a solvent company and you're compliant with HMRC, you've got a good history of compliance, then you can apply for a duty deferment account with that 10k waiver on the guarantee. So it means that so long as your duty liability doesn't exceed that 10k threshold on a monthly basis, then you don't need a customs guarantee. And the important thing to mention, because we've talked about customs procedures as well, is if you have, in terms of duty deferment accounts, it needs to cover the amount that you've deferred, the actual duty that you've deferred, but also it needs to cover any duty that's suspended in a customs procedure as well. So it's the notion of actual debt and potential debt. But there's a lot more information online around this. If you think you'd benefit from having, being able to defer that import duty and that import VAT, then it's certainly something to look at applying for if you don't have one already. Regulatory compliance, we've talked about in a couple of sessions now. We're still not there for certain sectors, and other sectors are having to grapple with potentially working with two different sets of regulation now. Around, the chemical sector is working with REACH, and then the CE mark impacts a number of different sectors. Those of you familiar with the CE mark will probably know by now that the UK's introduced its own, the UKCA mark. So there's, depending on the scenario of where the goods are going, you might have to have a UKCA mark, you might still have to have the CE mark, and you might have to have a UKNI mark that's accompanied by a CE mark. So it messes with your head. The best place of advice on some of that is BSI, so the British Standards Agency. They have a foot in both camps, so they're able to issue CE marks and UKCA marks, and they're a great source of information about how we're dealing with Northern Ireland as well. I suppose the one that I would pick up on at the moment is GDPR. So GDPR is still a sticking point in the negotiations, and we're still not able to meet what the EU refer to as their adequacy levels around data protection. So to cover ourselves, where we are either obtaining or processing or storing EU data, then we have to start introducing contractual clauses in our contracts, or perhaps within our customer terms and conditions. The best source of advice on this is the Information Commissioner's Office. That has a kind of whizzy interactive tool that will help you determine the right clause to put where. But technically we need that in place really legally without a trade deal if we are bringing in EU data and processing it and so on from the 1st of January, where we're not being legally correct, shall we say. So we need those clauses in place. Intrastat I mentioned earlier, so exporters can do away with this form of reporting from the 1st of January. As importers, we still need to carry on filing those intrastat returns until the end of next year. So, but only obviously if you're over that 1.5 million threshold in terms of arrivals from the EU. Commercial contracts and obligations. Here I'm really talking about scrutinising those contracts that you have with EU suppliers to make sure that they don't still refer to anything about us being a member of the EU or refer to any regulation that actually we're not obligated to comply with now that we're out of the EU. So really scrutinise those commercial contracts and also think about them in reference to Incoterms as well. So as I said before in these presentations, we've traditionally shipped goods door to door for intra-EU trade, and that's worked fine because we've not had these border controls or these customs formalities. But it becomes an entirely different ballgame from the 1st of January. So on the import side of things, as I mentioned earlier, if you've got suppliers that are supplying you Ex Works and you are responsible for the carriage to you're responsible for the carriage to their premises to collect those goods, that could leave you open to having to do the to actually having to make the export declaration as well, which is not something you really want to do. And so start having a talk with them about what trade terms or what Incoterms they're going to continue supplying your goods to you at. Similarly, on the flip side of things, if they're supplying you delivered duty paid here in the UK, or if they're supplying to your premises in the UK currently, that will see them potentially delivering under what we call delivered duty paid, whereby they become responsible for paying the import duty and the import VAT in the UK, and they'll have to register for a UK URI number and register for VAT here in the UK, which is probably not a term they want to continue supplying to you on. So it's really important that you have those open and honest, frank dialogues now so that each party is clear of what their obligations and responsibilities are from the turn of the year. And then finally, authorised economic operators. So this gained an awful lot of interest back in 2018 when we were looking at a no deal, and the government started to say if we had AEO accreditation that our goods would be fast tracked through customs. It doesn't really work like that. If you think about groupage loads, for example, where there are a number of consignments from different exporters or different suppliers coming into the UK, realistically they're not going to filter through that groupage load and find yours because you're an AEO accredited and ship that out. It doesn't really work like that, but there are a number of benefits to it. Overwhelmingly, there's access to those simplified procedures, custom simplified procedures that I talked about. They're a lot easier to obtain. There is the notion of a 70% reduction or a complete waiver on your customs guarantee as well. But then there's also the reduction in kind of pilfering and stealing of goods, which does happen in import when goods are tampered with. Under these situations, there's two different types of AEO status. You can apply for the customs AEO, which demonstrates to HMRC that you've got, a level of, how could you say, systems management, or just your procedures are documented and your company is in good shape and you're compliant, and that makes you slightly less touch or less risk for HMRC. So that's the customs side of things, but there's also the other side, which is around safety and security, whereby you really put your premises and your whole supply chain through quite rigid testing to make sure that it is as secure as it can be, and that in turn actually can result in a reduction in the chance of any kind of loss of goods or pilfering or stolen goods and so on. So there's a number. I haven't done it justice in a couple of seconds. It is a good accreditation. It works as a kite mark. There's no cost to obtaining it other than your cost, which you can't underestimate. They say if you've got ISO, then you're part of the way there, because a lot of your documentation is there and your processes are mapped and so on. But the only cost to obtaining it really is the time that you want to put into it, and also the time to sit down with HMRC when they come to do their site visits and make sure that everything's as it should be. But look at it. If you're importing in high volumes, or you're looking to increase the volumes, then AEO status could be something for you. It certainly helped a number of organisations prepare optimally for Brexit, because they're part of the way there already. So I have included, I'm just very conscious of time, I've included the list of things that you should be looking at, as always. So check your URI numbers, check to see if you need an EU URI number based on the Incoterms we've talked about. Spend some time looking at your commodity codes if you haven't already. Determine whether you need an intermediary. Check those simplified procedures, see if you're eligible. So if you've got that good compliance record, then potentially you would be. Look at your commodity codes in light of the duty that you might have to pay. So take a look at the new UK global tariff and determine what the impact is going to be on your margins if you're going to be paying the import duty. Determine how you're going to pay for VAT on goods. Are you just going to settle up as they come in per consignment? Are you going to get a duty deferment account and use it for that? Are you going to use postponed VAT accounting? Think about whether a duty deferment account would be good for you. Overwhelmingly, the one is the border requirements for those goods coming in. So absolutely make sure you look at your commodity code and understand what the documentary requirements are, and whether you need any kind of pre-notification or pre-authorization for those goods to clear. Kind of covered so much of this. The only one I haven't mentioned is currency and exchange risk. You know, are you likely to be really badly hit by any kind of currency volatility? Should we leave without a deal? Or even if we do leave with a deal, we don't know what the market's going to do. Should you be looking at currency hedging, anything like that? Look at the flow of your goods, which I mentioned really early on. So if your goods are coming in through some of the southern ports, should you be thinking about building a moderate stock buffer? I never advocate, you know, huge stock, because that causes problems tying up cash flow in stock. But should you be buying in a little bit extra to make sure that you're not impacted by any delays? Get some training. So HMRC has invested 100 million in terms of funding for companies that are impacted by Brexit, in terms of making declarations and so on. They've announced this funding, and people are using it for training. They're using it for recruitment, and also purchasing custom software if they're going to be making those declarations themselves. And then finally, again, everything that I've talked about and more is at the back here in terms of the sources of additional support. So that's really it from me. And I'm conscious I've gone way over time again, as always. I'm just going to have a quick look at the questions here. So Brett's asking, we import machinery and also software. My question is about software purchases. This is delivered to us by the cloud, so there's no actual goods crossing the border. We then sell the software to UK Ireland. Yeah, there are some considerations that you need to be aware of, Brett. But I probably, if it's okay with you, I would like to take that away and look at it to make sure that I'm giving you the absolute right answer. So if you could do me a massive favour and just drop me an email, I'll take that on as something to look at for you, especially. And then Ursula, if the goods are ordered and paid for before the 31st, how the transport will happen? Yeah, unfortunately, Ursula, yes. So it's the goods moving that triggers that duty and that VAT requirement. So even if they've been paid for in advance, it's making the declaration and shipping the goods that prompts that duty. So if they were shipped after the 1st and there was no trade deal in place, then you would still be liable for the duty and the import VAT. Obviously, if there's a trade deal in place, you might not have to pay the duty, but the import VAT would be payable. John is asking why different codes for imports and exports. So the way that the commodity code is structured is it's based on a harmonized system, which means that the first 6 digits should be the same globally, irrespective of where that product is. There's some 200 countries sign up to that convention. But then we've been part of the EU external tariff. So our commodity codes have typically, they've been basically 8 digits. You've had the first 6 digits made up by the HS system. Then the EU applies it's the last 2 digits. And then the UK on imports has added a further 2 digits to make import commodity codes 10 digits long, but those last 2 digits are just for statistical purposes here in the UK, so we can, build those statistics on those goods coming in. Moving forward, you'll see in the UK global tariff that we revert to 8 digits for imports and exports moving forward. So we kind of lose the notion of that 10 digits for import once we've left the EU. If an FTA is reached between the UK and EU, should we then register for approved exporter or REX to allow for the origin statements in the invoices instead of providing COOs? So the certificates of origin are going to be replaced by the UK's variant. So the EC certificate of origin, which is the non-preferential certificate, that's going to be replaced by a UK version, and the EU is, the chambers are working on that now. Should you move to approved exporter to make those kind of invoice declarations or RECs? I don't see why not. I think obviously with approved exporter and RECs, you're talking about exports rather than imports that we're talking about today. But with approved exporter is a good status to have. It's great to be able to make those invoice declarations, which remove the requirement for that, paying for that certificate of origin. However, if we're talking about exporting to the EU, we're not anticipating the EU to start demanding that we provide certificates of origin. Preference certificates, absolutely. If there's a trade deal, we'll have to provide preference certificates that relate to UK country of origin. But in the absence of a trade deal, we're not expecting them to all of a sudden demand that we make invoice declarations for our goods being shipped to them. So it's a good simplification to have approved exporter and RECs too. But I think if you're just exclusively dealing with EU traffic, I don't think it's that necessary from the 1st of January, if that makes sense. Obviously, if I haven't answered that question perfectly, feel free to drop me an email on it. But I think Sam and Stuart, that's really it from me today. Sorry if I've gone over ever so slightly.
All right, Andrea, thank you. We've got quite a lot of questions in the chat. I'm happy if you want to go through them. If you've got time, I have got time today. I haven't got to dash off to any other webinars.
That's okay. So I can certainly try. I have another call in 15 minutes, but I don't mind running over slightly. So the session mainly bring in goods from the USA, but also from the Netherlands and Hungary. The Hungary lines generally go to Ireland, but will be coming into the UK after the 1st of January. Can the new procedures be done in-house with the new external? Sorry, Sam, are this first one, are they all one question?
Yes, they're all from the same person.
Okay.
I got emailed those last night.
Oh, okay, no worries. So the goods are coming in from the US, also from the Netherlands and Hungary. The Hungary lines generally go directly into Ireland, but will be coming into the UK after the 1st of January. Can the new procedures be done in-house? If they mean declarations, making the import declarations, absolutely, but you would need to obtain a chief badge, which is filling in a form C1800 and then purchasing third-party software that kind of interfaces with chief. Generally, our shippers clear the goods on our behalf and we use their deferment account number. That's really a discussion for them as to whether or not they'll still allow you to do that. Quite possibly, or they might look at the fact that the import duty deferment is going to increase when we're talking about EU countries as well as rest of the world countries, so they may not be likely or they may not want to take on that much liability. But having said that, usually the way they work is that it's offset against their duty deferment account number very temporarily, just to clear the goods, and then you settle with them before they deliver the goods to you. So their risk is minimal. Obviously, how that differs from having your own duty deferment account number is, with an agent, they'll typically charge you, as I say, before delivering your goods. With your own duty deferment account number, you can have that kind of up to 30 days credit if you like to pay that amount. And in terms of the invoice, the import declaration, it works the same way. So you'll give authorization to your shipper to offset the duty to your duty deferment account number rather than theirs. Will we be able to defer declarations for 6 months? It entirely depends on the commodity code of the goods. So if it's standard goods, shall you say, or even some of the goods that have additional requirements around plants and so on, you possibly can. But really look at your commodity code, and that will determine that for you. How do we find a template for the customs form commercial invoice that will be required by border controls? Are there any standard forms you can obtain? There are standard forms, there are standard commercial invoice templates on the website, on the internet, everywhere. But then they will require more information. So a lot of freight forwarders are now asking that, in addition to the commodity code that the customs procedure code is put down there, they're demanding that a lot more information goes on to the commercial invoice, because that's what they use to actually make the import declaration. So I'm not sure that there's a template that really lays out everything. No, I'm sorry, I can't really help with that. Obviously, commercial invoice templates are available everywhere, but things that you would, or what I can do actually, is I have a list of everything that should go on a commercial invoice. So if I send that to Sam, she can distribute it. If you obtain a template, and then you can include all of the information that I'm thinking should be on there, that might be the best way of doing it. So I'll do that with Sam. Interested in the VAT impact on imports from Poland. Confused. Do I need a guarantee? Do I pay VAT to supplier, or just insert on my VAT return? Okay, so goods coming in from Poland, irrespective of whether there's a trade deal, will be subject to what we call import VAT. Now, that import VAT can be paid to HMRC in order to clear your goods, or you can use postponed VAT accounting to account for that import VAT, so you can include it on your quarterly VAT return. So you've got the two options there. Do we still need to get enrolled on chief systems if we use FedEx for customs clearance or imports? No, FedEx is a fast parcel operator, so they use their own kind of system. So no, you don't. You'll be using that. They would technically be doing your customs clearance for you, or doing your documentation for you. Will the slides be available? Absolutely. We import metal alloy products from the US. Some products, aluminium, are subject to a standard tariff plus 25% regulatory tariff on US origin goods imposed after Trump placed them on. Once we leave the EU, will the EU-based 25 regulatory tariffs apply to US origin goods? That I don't entirely know. Again, take a look at your commodity code. We don't have clarity at the minute around quotas and so on, which is kind of linked to this. So quotas are I also explain them as kind of your what you call it, personal allowance on your self-assessment. So it might be that the UK introduces a quota on those goods, and so you can import so much of it without paying that higher rate, or until that quota is exhausted, and then it goes back up to the higher rate. But also remember that the UK is in control of its own kind of regulatory tariffs now, so it can choose to carry on applying what the EU does, or it can choose to just wipe out that tariff depending on what its trade ambitions are with that country of origin. So it's really looking at the commodity code and watching quite closely for announcements around further quotas and tariff clarification. We have commodity codes for the goods we import, but sometimes our supplier uses a code that we don't think is correct. You should absolutely use yours. So it is your legal obligation to make sure that that import declaration is true and correct. Otherwise, you could risk underpaying or overpaying import duty and VAT. So you can change the commodity code to that's on your commercial invoice. You can change it on the import declaration. Just reference why you've done that so that there's a clear audit trail through your records. But absolutely, you should be using the commodity code that you believe is correct. By controlled goods, may we take it that alcohol is in that category? Yes, yes. Excise goods are part of the controlled list goods. Hello, Andrea mentioned an HMRC email address to obtain. Yeah, about commodity codes. I will put that in the email that I send out to Sam with the slides and with what needs to go on the commercial invoice. I'll put that tariff classification email on there as well. How do we find a freight forwarder? When the company automatically deal with it for us. It depends on the Incoterms that they're using. If they're delivering, say, DAP, delivered at place, then they will be responsible for potentially getting the goods to you. But they may just do delivered at place and state that it's a UK port, for example. So that's why those Incoterms are really, really important, that you get to grips with your customers' understanding, your suppliers' understanding of their obligations after the 1st of January, and whether that's still palatable to both of you. So it's around those Incoterms. Who's responsible for determining the CPC? That's really you determining on what the purpose of the shipment is. So if it's a permanent import, then it would be 4,000 But if you're bringing goods into an inward processing or into a customs warehouse, then that will be slightly different. There's another presentation that we're doing around customs documentation coming up, where I go into a little bit more detail about that, but it's definitely the importer's responsibility to determine the right CPC code. Would you provide the link for the deferment application, please? Yeah, that's not a problem. I rely on a freight forwarder to do my import declaration. Would I still benefit from having a deferment account? Yes, I think you absolutely could look into it. It depends on the volume of imports, and it depends on that duty liability and whether or not your freight forwarder is still happy to use their deferment account. But also, as I mentioned just a moment ago, you have very little credit with them. They'll just use their deferment account to clear the goods, and then they'll invoice you in order to deliver the goods to you. Whereas your own deferment account, you will have that potential for 30 days credit before you have to pay. Are you able to provide a sample of what a commercial invoice looks like and the information that must contain? Yeah, I think we've kind of covered that, so I can certainly do that. Okay. Is that everything, Sam? Are there any more questions lurking anywhere else?
I think that's it, Andrea. Thank you for just staying on a bit longer to get through those. I really appreciate that. No, and thank you, Stuart.
That's absolutely fine.
So
could you possibly, Sam, is it possible for you to, Sam, would you be able to just make a copy of the chat dialogue so I can make sure that I don't miss anything, and just email that over to me?
Yes, no problem. I'll do a download of it at the end. So as I said, wonderful. The recording of the session and slides and all accompanying documents and useful information we will send out should be out before the end of the week. So sometime tomorrow, keep an eye on your inboxes for that. And if you've got any other questions, you've got Andrew's details have just been on the screen there. And I'll just pop up our Growth Hub details quickly whilst people are just leaving. In case anybody wants to get in touch with their local Growth Hub, then you can do. There's the details there. Oh. And if anyone's got any other questions, then just let us know and we'll be happy to help, and hopefully we'll see a lot of you again next week for next week's session. That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Sam, for hosting. Thanks, and Andrea. Stuart also. Thanks, Stuart, as well. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.